Karishma, can you please turn on your video? Welcome to the technical session. Hello again. Welcome to the technical session for today. For this session, we have as chair Karuna Rajiv, and I would invite Aditi to please introduce our chair for today.
Good evening, everybody. This session is chaired by Dr. Karuna Rajiv. Dr. Rajiv teaches English at Lady Shri Ram College for Women, University of Delhi. She has finished her PhD titled The Deceits of Mary Corelli, Gender, Narrative, and the Popular from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Her areas of research interest currently include 19th century studies, disability discourse, narrative discourse, and post-colonial discourse. I would now request Dr. Rajiv to take over the session.
Good evening, everyone. So we are on day 4 of what has been, I suppose, an abundantly engaging conference. This particular session as such is traversing texts from the 18th century till about the middle of the 20th century.
Karuna, there's some interruption over here. We ask everybody to please put your audios on mute. And Karishma, can you please turn on your video?
Ma'am, I'm connecting. Actually, some error.
Oh, okay.
Please give me a minute.
Anurima, that we should wait for the interpreter to come in, right? Because if her video is
yes, I think so.
So we'll wait a while.
Yeah. Let's wait for 2 minutes. Yeah.
Hello, ma'am. I am the other interpreter. We can start the session now. Karishma will join us later.
Okay, all right. Sure.
Okay.
I begin, Anurima.
Karuna, just give me one moment. I'm not being able to spotlight anybody.
Okay.
We are ready.
Okay, good evening once again. So as far as this session is concerned, we're already on day 4, as I've already stated. This particular session, Disability and Literary Narratives 1, has set of 4 papers ranging from 1726 with Gulliver's Travels till about the Tin Drum in 1959. So the papers as such are engaging with broadly the form of the novel, which is, as students of literature know, that theoreticians of the novel ranging from Raymond Williams, Mary Pooey, Nancy Armstrong, Terry Eagleton have looked at the association of the form with, let's say, bourgeois individualism, capitalism, the idea of materialism inherently tied to how the novel is a carrier of these ideas. Of course, disability scholars like Leonard G. Davis have articulated how they look at the novel form as such, as a vehicle of somewhere or the other carrying out the larger sort of considerations and the larger sort of preoccupations around enforcing certain ideas of disability among as a cultural sort of say construct. Of course, I mean, I'm using Davis's own quote as a linchpin on which to, set the 4 papers that we'll be looking at. One, of course, is the fact that he clearly states that the novel's goal is to reproduce on some level the semiologically normative signs surrounding the reader that paradoxically help the reader to read those signs in the world as well as the text. This normativity in narrative will by definition create the abnormal, the other, the disabled, the native, the colonized subject. If let's say on one end we have someone like Davis making this sort of articulation, then we could also look at perhaps or consider what the queer theorist Sarah Emmett says about just this idea of diversity that seems to be so strongly integral to the ways in which the current avatar of the liberal state is looking at inclusivity, right? So we're looking at the fact that, Sarah Emmett says that the promise of diversity is that it can be both attached to those bodies that look different and detached from those bodies as a sign of inclusion, right? So the promise of diversity could then be described as a problem. The sign of inclusion makes the signs of exclusion disappear. What is interesting is the 4 papers are traversing precisely the kind of period where the larger discourse of the liberal state, its investment in its subjects, its citizens, the idea of its of individuals as national citizens and subjects becomes a particular kind of preoccupation, which is something that has in some senses informed disability studies scholarship, especially with regard to literary representation of disability. So we have 4 very interesting papers lined up in this regard that will be, just looking at these, looking at a particular kind of way in which they want to unpack, unravel, and read these literary narratives. So each paper presenter gets about 20 minutes. We have begin with Dr. Sunanda Sinha, who I will introduce. At about 15 minutes, I will indicate that there are 5 more minutes left, if that is okay with the presenters. So without further ado, I'll begin with my introduction of the first presenter. Sunanda Sinha is an associate professor in the Department of English, Satyavati College, University of Delhi. Her areas of research interest include modern European drama, 19th century European realism, and modernism. She has published articles in significant national and international journals on wide topics including Kabir, modern European drama, Tahmina Durrani, Gugi wa Thiong'o, modern Indian poetry. In her 13 plus years in academics, she has worked as a teacher in charge of the English department, in charge of Army Girls Wing of NCC, coordinator of the NIRF, and has staged full-length plays and organized 2 national level debates. Her paper for today is titled Gendering Madness and Doubling Disability in JNI. Over to you, Dr. Sinha.
Garima, now I'm interpreting.
I can't see you on the spotlight. Please ask host to spotlight you.
Okay.
So since Anurima has indicated that the third speaker might not be joining, Anurima, am I to then allow each of the speakers perhaps another 10 minutes?
Yes, I think so. We'll have that time.
Okay, so then I will indicate to the speakers at about 20 minutes that they have another 10 minutes. And then we take up questions once we finish with all the 4 speakers. Would that be amenable to everyone?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm assuming yes.
Yeah, that works.
I think
Okay.
we can take 25 minutes per speaker, right?
Okay, 25 minutes per speaker. So I'll indicate at 20 minutes that you have another 5 minutes left, and then we'll have the 3 presenters, and then we'll take a round of questions. All right, without any more delay, over to you, Dr. Sinha.
Thank you. Karuna, Aishwarya, Enrika, Shankara, the organizing team, and those who have joined us. A very good afternoon to all. The title of my paper is Gendering Madness and Doubling Disability in Jane Eyre. I'll straight away come to the point. Bertha is mad throughout the novel.
And Rochester's handicap is introduced to influence a union with Jane and is partially cured by the end. There's hardly any warmth or competence assigned to Bertha, and the narrative only looks away from her being to close in on her growing resistance. There is a well-defined structural correspondence of Bildungsroman, interplay of dark and light binary, the desire of Jane and the metaphor of fire in the mapping of the doubling. They formulate and process instrumental details to determine a prefixed understanding of Bertha. The conceptual structure conveys a linear discourse in which her resistance is used as a manifestation and articulation of madness and to further the need to restrain Bertha. In the light of what I have spoken right now, the paper will center sexuality, femininity, body, and resistance as sites that lead to a parallel gendered and a more potent conceptualization of madness. In the first part, I'm going to discuss Bertha's Bildungsroman, or the lack of it. Bertha's character is narrated by Jane, the omniscient narrator, and constructed by both Rochester and Jane. There's no effort to integrate her in the main plot, and she is restricted to the narrative margin, existing as a facilitator, fulfilling an influencer's motive in their romance. Her plot can be divided in two parts. Firstly, the cover-up for her existence, and later the revelation of her uneasy and undesired presence in the third floor room. Bertha's plot begins when Jane accepts the position of a governess and moves to Thornfield. A few days later, she saves Rochester from the fire, which she is told was started by a drunken help, Grace Poole. Jane's suspicion around the version grows by the presence of Grace in Thornfield, and even after the negligent drunken episode. As the romantic plot proceeds, the mystery of the episodes hangs heavily around the narrative until Bertha makes a physical appearance right before the wedding day of Rochester and Jane. All this while, there is a forced absence of her presence. Though she is constructed for the reader, she is rendered invisible in the seemingly Gothic feel to the mystery surrounding of Thornfield. Her invisibility seems to fulfill the tenet that places the text in the Gothic literary tradition, and she is made to shoulder the Gothic along with her disability. So her introduction is a curious laugh, which is distinct, formal, mirthless. It stops, becomes louder, becomes low, is tragic, ghostly, and fearful. All evidences of Bertha's laugh and later her acts are readily attributed to Grace. She then is blamed, chided, monsterized, and criminalized for the acts of Bertha. The underlying mystery surrounding Grace furthers the Gothic thread of a nurse attending a mad woman and serves the rightful purpose of adding up to the intrigue of Bertha. Every time Bertha manages to sneak out and unleash havoc, we are told Grace's drunken carelessness caused the episode. Grace then is not just a cover-up for Bertha's existence. Her carelessness is also the reason why Bertha manages to make her presence felt. If it wasn't for her drunken carelessness, it seems as if Bertha would never really exist in the text. Interestingly, Interestingly, both share a symbiotic relationship of coexistence and are tempered by the acts and capacities of each other. Her madness is as essential as is Grace's carelessness for the existence of the two. What started with the tragic laugh, eccentric murmurs, the unnatural gurgled moan progresses to the quarreling between Bertha and her brother, snarling, snatching sounds of almost like dogs quarreling. Later, Rochester narrates, rather constructs a one-sided version of Bertha's background, in which we are told she belongs to a rich plantation family of Jamaica, had a genetic history of madness, and because of that, the father of Bertha agreed for a generous dowry of 30,000 pounds. It is interesting to see how the unique medium of Rochester's active memory is used to recollect episodes which are biased and tinged with hatred. I'm just quoting him. I found her nature wholly alien to mine, her taste obnoxious to me, her caste of mind common, low, narrow, and singularly incapable of being led to anything higher, expanded to anything larger. Whatever topic I started immediately received from her a turn at once coarse and trite, perverse and imbecile. It is also interesting to note that in the telling, which of course is through Jane, Jane is recollecting what Rochester is recollecting, and the entire active memory on the side of both the narrators seems like it is tinged with the same bias. Soon after marriage, Bertha is confined to the third floor attic with Grace Poole. The entire telling of her background is a sort of a dramatic monologue by Rochester, which at times is tempered by Jane's responses in such a manner that it impedes any association of normalcy to Bertha. Jane, at the center of the omniscient narrative of the so-called progressive Bildungsroman, readily attributes to Bertha's madness. She gives rise to and enables a preconceived idea of madness and its history. There's a conscious looking away from her mental state and therapeutic needs, while the narrative focuses on Jane's Bildungsroman. At the end, even Saint John is praised by Jade and reconsidered kindly. But no efforts are made to erase Bertha's stigma. She dies with the burden of starting a fire that causes the death and disability, causes her death and disability of Rochester. Another reading of it could be Bertha as the reason for the reversal of situation, the conduit of the relationship. But there is some sort of in-betweenness in her telling by others that focuses more on the changed identity of Rochester and Jane and their Victorian relationship goals, while she lay dead as a stone with brain and blood scattered outside, is gory and revolting. In the next part, I will very briefly touch upon the discourse of darkness, racial inequity, and madness. There are complicit structures in the narrative which return time and again to the max spectacle of Bertha's mixed heredity, suggesting her parents wanted her to marry Rochester because he was a good race. Her dark face, discolored, fearful, appears ghastly. Her features are savage. She's purple and has red eyes. She's tall, sturdy, and could match Rochester. Charlotte intentionally feeds the binary of dark and light, positioning Bertha in dark and Jane in light, and also entitles Rochester with male privilege. Bertha is at the receiving end. She has no rights, neither over her body or mind. She is the site of discursive construction where specific characteristics, dark and dangerous, or are attributed to her disability, and she is viewed within the parameters of her infirmities. According to Firdaus Azim, Bertha is imagined white or passing white in the novel and in the retrospective narrative. But by the time we reach towards the end of the novel, her whiteness is later appropriated to black, the form in which she becomes visible in the novel. Bertha is shaped by color signifiers that enable an uncivil and animalistic racial specificity to her mental condition. Next, I'm going to discuss the rhetoric of desire and Bertha. Now, chapter 12 in Jane Eyre is a poignant cry for equal treatment and an exposition of woman's desire by Jane. I'm just quoting her. Women feel just as men feel. They need exercise for their faculties and a field for their efforts as much as their brothers do. They suffer from too rigid a restraint, too absolute a stagnation, precisely as men would suffer. And it is narrow-minded in their more privileged fellow creatures to say that they ought to confine themselves to making pudding and knitting stockings, to playing on the piano and embroidering bags. It is thoughtless to condemn them or to laugh at them. Interestingly, right after this poignant discourse on woman's desire and being, we are subjected to Jane's conjectures of on the sights and sounds of Bertha. That is how she's introduced. And then again, of course, she associates them with Grace Poole. Her scrutiny is imprisoned in the strangeness of Grace's character and appearance. On one hand, she voices the most compelling argument in favor of the autonomy and the difference that that is how women are. On the other, she denies the same scope to Grace and Bertha by categorizing them as deviant and strange. The narrative sources each episode of Bertha in which the body becomes a bearer of meaning. Charlotte works to distinguish the nature of agency assigned to Bertha and Jane. She also parallelly reinforces her status quo and the perils of her degeneracy of Bertha's body and mind. There are marked boundaries between Jane and Bertha. The rebellious feminism attributed to Jane is notably absent for Bertha, a unique odd division with exactly opposite notions of performance, experience, and desire. The paradigmatic binary is furthered by two separate methods used to define sexuality. In the hands of Jane, it becomes a discourse of feminism, whereas for Bertha, her sexuality functions violently, destructively, and invokes established paradigms of sexuality of disabled people. The distinguishing attributes of womanhood, sexuality, and motherhood are not formulated for Bertha, and the reader is accustomed to and overpowered with her deranged behavior and the urgent need to restrain her. Bertha's dependency for normalcy is further associated with her asexual existence. The novel overlooks her womanhood, her need for sex, her reproductive ability, desire to have children. Fine and Ash, in their article Disability Beyond Stigma, Social Interaction, Discrimination, Activism, have discussed how normative femininity is denied to disabled women. Bertha's docile body, the unchanging mute sexual identity with no dynamism or fluidity, is the desired body in Jane Eyre. The complete suppression of space and power in Thornfield Hall negates the possibility of cure for Bertha's condition. Hence, that which is curable, that which is not curable, is sexually odd, different, and unacceptable. The dominant conservative Victorian culture of healthy female sexuality within the wedded bliss is pitted against the aberrant body and mind of Bertha. Her madness has made her sexless, her desires, her needs, and companionship are crushed until her mental state. The mental capacity becomes an indicator of a disabled need, non-existent needs. The sterile complicity is constructed as idle, and the novel hardly engages with the fact that whether Bertha would have cherished a family, free life, or just a simple household. Another issue related to the same point is the problematic inference that any interaction of Bertha, human or otherwise, is troublesome. Her level of distress, loneliness, and vulnerability is strengthened by the social isolation imposed on her in the name of safety. Her physical separation from the common spaces of the house to the third floor attic tantamounts to an admission of an access restriction preventing her from association with the normal beings and spaces in the house. The question then arises is, how does something as natural as desire and sexuality could flourish or even exist in a household which is structured on prevention, coercion, and abuse? And to put things in a wider perspective, there is a conversion of feelings of companionship and the idea of relationship when it comes to Jane and Rochester. And Rochester, in one of the episodes, he solemnly swears, and I'm quoting him, "Every atom of your flesh is dear to me as my own. In pain and sickness, it would still be dear." For Rochester to hide Bertha through a despicable living arrangement and yet profess his dedication to Jane in sickness and health undercovers a discriminatory crisis at the heart of the novel. Jane's acceptance of a subservient role, shorn of excessive passion, rewards her with a husband, motherhood, home, and a status in conventional Victorian society. Bertha, on the other hand, is cast down and punished for her lurid presence and sexuality by depriving her of social, physical, personal needs, and later the exorcist spectacle of Thornfield Hall through the fire and violent death of Bertha. I'm going to discuss the fire motive. The fire motive in Jane Eyre is critically crucial to the psychological reduction of Bertha. At the first glance, it is used to prolong the hopelessness, dreary Gothic shadow over her characterization. On a deeper look, it resonates with her situation and forms an uncanny double. Elizabeth Bronfen's work over her dead body, Death, Femininity, and the Aesthetic discusses the doubling of characters with the logic to nurture a binary against peace, religion, and God. In this context, Bertha is chaos, anti-religion, and absolute evil. Similarly, Bertha as the repressed double of Jane in the equation of the divine and the devil suitably fulfills what Goober and Gilbert call the truest and darkest double. Unlike these two binaries, the metaphor of fire introduces the impediment, and according to Ray Chow, in terms of the plot structure, the fire removes the impediment, the madwoman. At the first fire, which also marks the presence of Bertha, there is a change in the demeanor of Rochester, which becomes desperate and brooding. This episode marks the beginning of many such occasions wherein fire is the silent background to the simmering romance and interaction between Rochester and Jane, and also leads to their intimacy. On the other side of the wall and the fire is Bertha's madness, which is simmering in the same propensity. The presence of fire in the absence of Bertha, the presence of fire and Bertha together, the penultimate torching of Thornfield Hall that consumes Bertha and cripples Rochester resonates with the symbolic life-generating and destructing power of fire. Bertha too destroys, purifies, and generates life through the unsettling chaos she introduces in Rochester's life that leads to the new beginning for both Jane and him. Bertha dies in the fire she begins. Rochester is crippled by the fire she sets. She jumps to her dress and also pulls down the structure of Thornfield Hall, the very structure that had incarcerated her. The fire resonates with the destruction of the space that she was confined to. The symbolic fall of the building is the breaking free from the barrier of the walls and the intent behind the structure of the master. Fire changes the equation between Jane and Rochester and establishes a sort of equality between the two. Bertha is responsible for Rochester's disability and the dilution of Jane's spirit. Her absence, death of course, sets in motion a boundary for both Rochester and Jane, where both are sighted and tied together in limited possibility, a sort of a castration of their dreams. Bertha's removal from the narrative coincides with the disturbing dampening of Jane's feminist spirit, a sort of what is made to appear a natural compromise to settle for disabled Rochester. All of his sins are purged by the fire and pave the way to let Jane reconsider their union as a legitimate closure of their relationship. This fire and its consequences also change Jane's view of St. John from cold-hearted and repressed to a philanthropic soul. And of course, nothing changes for Bertha. But then, the end of Bertha renders Jane as a marker of sane, fulfilling, earnestly devoted nurturer fixed in a conventionally linear role. The demise of Bertha, consequently, the end of all antithetical doubling, also ends the straight-jacketed approach of Jane and removes her from the doubling equation to place her as a more acceptable, nurturing, and forgiving Victorian woman. That was what my paper was about, and I had actually timed it for 20 minutes because that is what we were told.
Sorry, just a technical glitch at my end. Thank you, Sunanda. I actually have an abundance of 5 minutes, but clearly you've neatly timed your paper. So thank you for your presentation. I think I will round up my round of comments by the time we finish with the other two presenters. We'll move on to our second presenter for today. This is Aishwarya Jha. Aishwarya Jha is a PhD research scholar in the Department of English, University of Delhi. Her area of research is the contextualization of disability studies in literature and films. Her paper for today is titled Dismantling the Normative, Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travel, 1726. Over to you, Aishwarya.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. Firstly, I'd like to apologize because just 15-20 minutes before the session, electricity went off at my place. I'll be using flashlight. So please bear with me. And I'm so sorry for the inconvenience caused. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible, Aishwarya. Please go
Okay.
ahead.
Yeah,
You're audible and also visible. Not too much of an issue with as far as connectivity is concerned.
All right. Okay, great. So the topic for my paper is Dismantling the Normative, Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travel. Now, Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travel has been read as a satire, as children's literature, as a travelogue, a fantasy fiction, a science fiction, and even from a colonial perspective, and many other recognized discourses. But surprisingly, rarely do we hear that it has been read. It has been one of it is been read from the disability perspective. However, when you look at it, it is one of the earliest novels which explore the discourse of disability at the grassroots level. By questioning the whole construction of the normative, Swift's text not only dismantles the binaries between the abled and the disabled, but also in its own way, it establishes that abnormal as a social response to deviation from the normative. So my presentation will closely examine the text from the lens of disability studies and academically establish that the normal is a construct. So across ages, disability has been viewed under various typified perspectives, ranging from divine curses, stock representations, comic reliefs, pitiful persons in need of rescue by the able-bodied. In literature, disability representation dates back to the time of classical folk tales and epics. We have tales of Tiresias, Oedipus, Shakuni, Manthara, which provide enough evidence to substantiate that divine punishments or rewards for villainy or virtuousness is a primary cause of a person's disability. The motif of karma attached to a disabled character is more prominently visible later. For instance, the character of Richard in Shakespeare's Richard III, who is, and I quote, not shaped for sportive tricks, but rather is deformed, unfinished, sent before his time, and is determined to prove to be a villain. Quote close. Similarly, the mad woman in the attic that was just talked about, she is kept chained in the house by Mr. Rochester, who is widely read from the discourse of gender studies, but she can also be read from the discourse of disability studies. However, instead of focusing on the lived experiences of the disabilities, the focal point has generally been to employ representative strategies to present disability as a stock feature of characterization, as well as opportunistic allegorical rules. Disability theorists David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder, in their book Narrative Processes, explain this neglect through the concept of narrative processes, which provides, and I quote, disability has been used throughout history as a crutch upon which literary narratives lean for their representational power, disruptive potency, and analytical insight. They go on to state that unlike the absence of other distinctions like gender, race, and caste from literature, disabled body has been ever present in literature as contrast to the normative. This quotes open, disabled people's social invisibility has occurred in the wake of their perpetual circulation throughout print history. Before going into the understanding of deviance or differencing, it is extremely important to understand the forces behind the construction of this normative concept. In the book, Exploring Normativity in Disability Studies, Nick Watson says, quotes open, disability, both as a phenomenon and as a concept, in its essence, is in its essence normative. It expresses normative ideas and assumptions concerning what kinds of capacities or possibilities people should have or be afforded in order to lead a good life, and how society ought to be organized in order to treat its members equally and fairly. By totally inverting the whole concept of what defines the normal, or in fact, whether or not a term like normal exists, whether or not normal is definable, Gulliver's Travels breaks every sense of normative. On the surface, the novel traces adventures of the 18th century pragmatic voyager Gulliver, while within the same, it subverts human anatomy and exposes the structural constructs surrounding the superiority of man as the image of God himself. Unlike older times, in the 18th century, persons with disabilities were not looked down upon as being divinely penalized or segregated due to their physical attributes. They weren't mentally disabled due to the sins of their forefathers. Neither were they visually impaired, neither did their visual impairment grant them any celestial wisdom or predictive powers. There was a shift in the understanding of disability from the classical allegorical model to the medical model. New explanations were emerging, which questioned the ancient notion of divine and supernatural forces, causing a deformity or cosmic mishappening, creating disability within a person. Different appearance oblique behaviors of disabled persons was no longer looked from the cosmic significance or possession of their soul by some evil entity, but through the logical reasoning of a medical cause and subsequently search for ways to treat them. The disability model shifted from being charity-based to being scientifically explored. Henry Steiker, in his book History of Disability, observes that thinkers were looking to a natural sequence of events and no longer to a model one. Persons with disabilities were present at all levels of the society, from street-side armed beggars to established painters and musicians in the royal court. In the introductory part of Gulliver's Travel itself, it is established that Gulliver typifies the bourgeois gentleman on a voyage to seek a fortune. But the moment he discovers the Lilliputians with their 6-inch heights, he is the one with the deviance. His appetite, his appearance, and even the amount of he excretes is enormous to them. The Lilliputians think of Gulliver as a giant who could be tamed and used as a war weapon in the time of need. Separating the definition of normative from Gulliver's body, it is now attached to the Lilliputians for whom Gulliver is a giant to be made a spectacle of. However, this othering is vice versa, and for a long time, Gulliver's stubborn belief in his normativity does not allow him to accept the reality as a truth, and he thinks of it as a superficial novelty. Dennis Todd, in his book Imagining Monsters, Miscreations of the Self in the 18th century England, indicates that in doing so, Swift perhaps resorts to the utilization of a narrative processes throughout the novel. At quotes open, Swift makes the popular diversion of monster viewing the imaginative center of Gulliver's Travels. Gulliver, living under the naive illusion of being the normal, does not visualize beyond the external appearance and physicality of beings he encounters throughout his journeys. He is engaged in as much monster viewing as the Lilliputians, and this is perhaps why, instead of engaging with their views, Gulliver merely notes down their ideas like a dispassionate observer. Rosemary Garland Thompson, in her book Extraordinary Bodies, argues that those who engage in activities of monster viewing are unable to distinguish the monsters beyond their own corporeal bodies. Freaks and prodigies were solely bodies. Without the humanity, social structures confer upon them ordinary people, upon more ordinary people. In the second part of the novel, when Gulliver arrives at Brobdingnag, the definitions of normative are again inverted. Almost instantly, Gulliver passes a judgment for the Brobdingnagians, similarly on the basis of their sizes. And I quote, "For as human creatures are observed to be more savage and cruel in proportion to their bulk, what could I expect but to be a morsel in the mouth of the first among these enormous barbarians who would happen to seize me?" Quotes. Ironically, Gulliver is othering the giants on the basis of their size, while he himself is the object of segregation from the normative among the Lilliputians. In the incident where Gulliver is put on a show out of the carriage window, it seems as though the Brobdingnags are using Gulliver as a tool to conform to their own normativity. In book 3, Gulliver comes across the Strugglebugs, who are almost immortal. They lose their hair, teeth, memory, and even the ability to communicate, and they eventually become disabled and monstrous. While acknowledging the condition of the Strugglebugs as a sheer unlucky occurrence, he is not sympathetic towards their sufferings. Rather, he is of the view that they were despised and hated by all sorts of people. When one is born, it is reckoned ominous, and their birth is recorded very particularly. The Strugglebugs are despised by Gulliver, at least partially, due to their physical appearance. They were the most mortifying sight I ever beheld, and the women more horrible than the men. Besides the usual deformities in extreme old age, they acquired an additional ghastliness in proportion to their number of years, which is not to be described. However, the cause behind the aversion of the Strugglebugs is never explored by Gulliver in detail. Todd writes that Gulliver desires to know the monsters, but he must manage what he knows about them in order to defend himself against the humiliating knowledge they offer about himself. The humiliating knowledge referred here, in fact, is even more deviant, non-normative appearances. The Strugglebugs are human beings, much like Gulliver himself. Pointing to a sign of dispositional disability being exhibited by Gulliver, Christopher Gabbard, in his essay, Gulliver's Travels, Book 4, Blackboard Web Discussion, writes, and I quote, "While it cannot be said that Gulliver lives with an intellectual disability resembling any present-day diagnosis, he does answer to a dispositional disability that would have been recognized by the doctors of his own time. Gulliver exhibits a dispositional impairment known among the physicians as, within quotes, mobilitas omnius, or instability of opinion." Quotes close. Gulliver's mental instability causes him to unknowingly portray certain irrational behavioral traits. He is no longer a man of sound mind and judgment, and can never come to terms with his similarities with the Yahoos, as unlike the Huniums, they are savage and animalistic. In the incident of the tracks, he can never comprehend that the Yahoos can possess the intelligence of creating tracks for themselves and keep superimposing the existence of humans in the island. In fact, the Hunians, who are normalized and admired by the Gulliver for their reason and intelligence, are horses and not human beings. There occurs a shift in the determining trait of what is normative from bodily appearance to intellectual capacity. This shift is so intense for Gulliver that he wishes to embrace this identity and become one of them, renouncing his humanity and becoming a horse. Gulliver's Travel can be read as one of the earliest disability texts, and without as much as putting disability perspective out in the open, Swift amalgamates the disability perspectives by interrogating the construction of the normal. Within the novel, it is in a satirical and deeply impacting manner. Novel not only disposes of bodily differences as a cause of disablement, but also identifies intellectual and mental deviances as part of this discrimination. At a time when mental and intellectual disabilities were still a decade from being discovered and accepted by the society, Swift's text offers a window to opening our minds to interpretation of the text from disability perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Aishwarya, for your paper. We now move on to the third presenter for today. This is Shankara Reddy PG, who is a research scholar in English in the Department of English, Bangalore University, and an assistant professor in English, the Government First Grade College, Kolar. His paper for today is titled Understanding Resistance in the Tin Drum. Over to you, Shankar. You will have to unmute yourself, Shankar.
I'm unmuted. Good evening, everyone. Yes. Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are. You're audible.
Yeah. Thank you for the opportunity, respected organizers and other paper presenters, Madam Sunanda and Madam Aishwarya. Yeah, today's my paper is titled as Understanding Resistance in the Tin Drum. It's a novel written by Understanding Resistance in the novel The Tin Drum. It is a novel written by Gunter Grass. Let me define what I mean to say resistance in the context of the novel. Is my video clear?
Yes, the video is clear and the audio is also clear.
1 minute, sorry for the inconvenience. Right. Yeah, let me define what is the meaning I set forth with the title Understanding Resistance in the novel The Tin Drum, which is written by Gunter Grass. Resistance here, I mean to say it is opposition to the discrimination, or to the capacity to resist, or it is the power of a species to survive or reject or deny. In this context, I will be explaining the concepts related to the novel. In the novel, we have the protagonist character by name Oscar. Is a dwarf by nature. By birth he was all right, but at the age of 3 he decides to not to grow, and then he wants to be a dwarf. So that is the first stage. We see that he wants to resist, and in the beginning, to starts with, it is just he was adamant, and then there is some thought in him that he wants to resist and not to grow. But later on, entire his life, at every moment we see to that he goes on resisting, and then he doesn't want to accept whatever is around him. But for everything he has a reason, and then in the novel we examine that. So when Oscar took birth, he was welcomed by light bulbs and sensitive to the sound around him. His father, Herr Mazeroth, said, Oscar will take over business one day. At last, we know why we have been working our fingers to the bone. So when Oscar's father, says this, Oscar was not willing to, he decides not to grow. But Oscar was not interested in his father's words and liked his mother's idea of offering him a tin drum at 3 years old. Initially, resistance started for self-defense. After it spread to his daily life and for the sake of people around him. Oscar had received the love and comfort from his mother, which had made him adamant and mischievous. At the age of 3 years, Oscar gets a tin drum as a gift from his mother. Oscar declared that he would neither become a politician nor a greengrocer, but remain a 3 years old dwarf. On his third birthday, as his mother promised, he got the tin drum presented to him. Oscar ignored him taking over the business at the age of 21, according to his father's wish. and stopped growing not even an inch and devoted himself to drumming. But when he was three times smarter than his age. He was sound in mind and body, a smart boy, and matured inwardly and outwardly. He was so unassumingly destructive. No grown-up person would think of his non-perishable nature. After his third birthday, Oscar's ability of drumming and scream adds him to become more destructive, creating trouble and nuisance to everyone. Above all, a means of protest. Oscar's power of drumming and resistance can be seen in the text, page number 52. I quote, "The ability to drum up the necessary distance between grown-ups and myself on a toy drum developed soon after my fall down the cellar stairs, almost simultaneously with the emergence of a voice that allowed me to sing, scream at such a high pitch and with such sustained vibrato that no one dared take away the drum that pained their ears. For when my drum was taken from me, I screamed, and when I screamed, something quite valuable would burst into pieces. I was able to sing, shatter glass. My scream slew flower vases. My song caused windows to crumple to their knees and let drafts rule. My voice sliced open display cases like a chest and therefore merciless diamond, and without losing its innocence, assaulted the harmonious, nobly bred liquor glasses within, bestowed my loving hands and covered with a light film of dust." Unquote. With every new opportunity, Oscar expounded skill and felt overwhelmed. For Oscar, the drum is his weapon and identity. He never gave chance to anyone take the drum from him. When Oscar was taken to Dr. Hollis when Oscar was taken to Dr. Hollis in the hospital for body examination to know the reason for his slow growth, the doctor forcefully took the drum away from Oscar. He shattered the entire glassware of the hospital. Even at school, Oscar did not allow anyone to take his drum and defended screaming his teacher's eyeglasses into pieces. Though a small boy, Oscar resists every character in the novel except his mother. He expressed his resistance towards both his two father figures, John Bronsky and Alfred Matzerath. Oscar had cared for Poles, and he laments their helplessness in the hands of Germans and the dictator Hitler, though a dwarf himself. Oscar, who had stopped growing at 3-year-old, considers Barbara, a descendant of Prince Eugen, as his role model. Barbara had stopped growing at 10-year-old. Barbara knows the world and was cautious Oscar about the impending danger for dwarfs and the disabled people. They planned for resistance by reading the mood of the rallies and parades in public places and grandstands as audience. The dwarfs have an advantage that they are too little to lose each other, as they can squeeze into even the most crowded grandstands. Barbara and Oscar entertain the crowd at grandstand greatly. The grandstand had the troop of Hitler, SS, and SA army men. It also had bugle cops of Hitler's youth troop. Oscar drummed the entire crowd to jubilation, and a team of communist saboteurs escaped from the place. It was Oscar's trick on SA and SS officials. They were no match to him. Yet Oscar, a 3-year-old, was underestimated of his skill and manipulation. In the year 1938, Oscar was successful in disrupting the events of the Oak and lose their forces. Oscar resisted the Danzig citizens with his Oscar resisted the Danzig citizens. The Danzig is the city in German, which is Poland now. With his piercing, he skillfully broke the window panes and attracted the citizens to steal their choice things. He attempted to steal all and sundry elderly gentlemen, counter jockeys, maids, and retired teachers, and fulfilled their desire of lifetime. Oscar cultivated resistance towards God for ideal presence of Jesus in the Sacred Heart Church. He hung the drum in Jesus' neck and expects to drum. That's a miracle. I mean, that he expects as a miracle. When it did not happen, he removes the drum from Jesus. I mean, from Jesus. Oscar declares, Oscar is more Jesus than Jesus is. When Oscar's mother, Agnes, dies, he never wept for her, he resisted. The understanding in him is that he had been with her and knew her guilt. He got convinced that there is no logic in weeping, but attributed in his own way by, say, I mean, I quote here, finally, no longer able to contain myself. I shaped the ideal vision of her gray-eyed beauty on my drum at Mama's deathbed, page number 149. He feels his mother got rid of from the guilt of triangular relationship. Oscar resisted any kind of discrimination in his mother's funeral, and he allowed Marcus, a Jew, pay his last respect. Having stopped growing at 3-year-old, Oscar survives against all odds. Though a disabled person, he admires and becomes passionate about Sister Inge. After his mother's death, he stopped visiting the Sister Inge, his Saturday visit to the church and Alston Theatre. He lost interest in rallies and trumpeters trade, but he turned his interest to books. Later, in 3 years, Oscar got acquainted with Roswitha Raguna, Italy's most famous somnambulist, narrated his story to her and presented a heart-shaped, sank-shattering glass. When Oscar sensed that there is danger for Midgate, tin drummers secured one intact. Oscar secured one intact and 2 damaged drums. Oscar, for his livelihood, worked in various jobs. Though a dwarf, he is manipulated to kill his presumptive fathers, John Bronsky and Alfred Mazrat. He was a father to Kurt and husband to his stepmother. Oscar is an embodiment of all qualities who gets convicted for Sister Dorothy's death, though he was not at fault. He was an inmate in the mental hospital. To sum up, the novel Thin Drum by Gunter Grass captures the marginalized, cornered, and subjugated position of disabled people, and strong resistance is shown by the disabled character Oscar. As Brown says, resistance can occur for power, inequality, and social change. Oscar, a protagonist in the novel, shows his resistance against a political ideology and political power, though a dwarf himself, but he has the unassuming ability and manipulative power that an able-bodied individual cannot exhibit. The tin drum in his weapon. The tin drum is his weapon, presented to him by his mother at 3 years old, and the scream adds impetus to his resistance. With the ability to drumming and shattering, he takes control over the situation around him. He is against hegemonic practices, aggressions, able-bodied norms, and discriminatory practices. Oscar, a genome who had stopped growing at 3 years old but has the maturity of an adult, understands society, politics, and religious aspects of his world. Oscar becomes the leading force to oppose the oppressive rule of Hitler against the Polish people, the Jews, and the disabled. His resistance is so powerful, and it is said Oscar is more Jesus than Jesus is. The abusey construction of the disabled is apparent in the excerpt. Oscar, the shattered image of humanity, an accusation, a challenge, a timeless expression of the madness of our century, and ended by thundering across easels. Don't draw his cripple, slaughter him, crucify him, nail him to the paper with charcoal, page number 403. Oscar opposes the abuse and extermination of cripples. Oscar is a dwarf, a drummer, a stonecutter, an entertainer. He is Oscar Majorat, Oscar Bronsky, Oscar Regona, Satan and Christ. Is a lover of Gertrude and Sister Dorothea. He is a husband to many. He was the head of court justice. Oscar left no stone unturned to challenge the demeaning of disabled people. Oscar's life is led against all odds and is a really testimony for a disabled person. Thank you. I end my presentation here.
Thank you. While I use my privileges as a chair to both appreciate the papers that our three presenters have provided us, I would request those of you who have questions to please put them in the chat box. I'm just going to begin in sequential order with regard to the papers presented. Sunanda, I greatly appreciated some of the ways in which you've navigated the terrain of sexuality and desire, precisely because you've gone beyond some of the more conventional readings of desire in Jane Eyre. I'm particularly, it's also the novel that has, in that sense, created a lot of conversations as well as dialogues amongst disability scholars, precisely because of the ways in which disability and impairment figures so strongly in the novel. So we're looking at, for instance, one of the first instances in the novel of Jane's encounter with Rochester as a temporary impairment. He falls off the horse and then he has to use her as a prosthetic, which is again something that is replicated later in the novel subsequent to his blindness. So there are varied ways, for instance, the classical way in which it's been read in terms of an equalizing pattern with regard to, let's say, women's positions in the 19th century and the kind of partnership that is evoked between Rochester and Jane, right? So there is, of course, Ellen Showalter's classical position that has been, interrogated by subsequent generations of feminist scholars. But of course, disabled scholars have gone on to look at the kind of ways in which there is an underlying sense of problematic in the ways in which, let's say, Rochester's impairment and subsequent disability figures. There is also, very interestingly, precisely because you played with the notion of sexuality, there's a way in which, let's say, Bertha is, especially in the cinematic adaptations, as for instance, Martha Stoddard Holmes has famously argued that Bertha is presented as a desexualized object, whereas, what do we make of Rochester's sexuality, especially because there have been so many instances. One of the things that, there's not too much scholarship that abounds on this is the ways in which, for instance, there has been multiple articulations and engagements about sexuality and disability in the novel and conversations between Jane and Rochester. For instance, the first instance that Bertha is revealed, right, as his wife, he basically talks about conjugality, addresses, what it means to, therefore have her as a wife. And thereafter, when you're looking at, the final scene where he talks about, his own incapacity. And of course, someone like David Bolt has gone on to read this scene so remarkably well, where when he embraces Jane, when she encounters him subsequent to her returning as the wealthy woman, there's a particular kind of reading about the sexualization of the over-sexualization of the blind man and the lecherousness of the blind man. And he's read this and he's, the ways in which, for instance, your paper offers us a particular kind of way in which you want to engage with Bertha as a desexualized character. For instance, it invoked for me again Tobin Cybers' work about, desexualized desexualization of disabled people and how disabled people have resisted this through self-articulation and first-person narrative. So I'm very interested in how you want to read this, a particular kind of way in which, you have a performance of masculinity as far as Rochester is concerned, and then you have this a particular kind of way in which Bertha is presented to us, right? And how you want to complicate this, particularly because, we look at the classical Gilbert Hubbard thing of Bertha being the feminized, sexualized, dark other to Jane. So that's one query that I had. The other query, of course, playing again with your engagement with fire. right? In the sense of how it's invocative of desire, how it is invocative of passion, the very sense in which fire is talking about explosion. But what I perhaps in an overreading read in your paper is also the subtle ways in which you're talking about implosion, the fact that there is something that is happening to these women in the inside, in terms of the fact that they're imploding while you're just looking at a particular kind of way in which you just want to take in a reading of desire is explosive. So what I am interested in, of course, again, with regard to the ocular centricism of Jane Eyre as a text, the fact that visuality and embodiment are so crucial to this text, right? In the sense of how it plays with the idea of sight, how it's playing with the idea of embodiment, whether you're looking at it in terms of Plain Jane, Ugly Rochester, Monstrous Bertha. So you're looking at these varied ways in which, let's say, these are ocular sort of registers for these characters, and ocular registers that are enforcing embodiment of a particular kind. So therefore, when you're looking at the idea of fire, I'm also looking at fire as light, insight, allowing for the very sort of obvious ways in which we are looking at fire as insight, and how you want to look at, let's say, the more complicated terrain of negotiating with visuality as far as Jane Eyre is concerned. That's my question to you. I'm also parallelly, I think, going to look at certain things that I want to address towards Aishwarya and Shankara, and then hopefully some of the other participants can also respond. Aishwarya, I very strongly appreciated the fact that you invoke Stryker precisely because when you were making a particular kind of way in which you're distinguishing between the disabled and the non-disabled body, bringing to a particular kind of light the idea of a pre-enlightenment sense of cosmic significance, right? The logic of, let's say, relying on divinity as a particular kind of paradigm through which you want to look at able-bodied, the disabled body, etc., etc. I was particularly glad that you invoked it precisely because Gulliver's Travels, coming to us from the 18th century, is a text that is rooted in a particular kind of tradition, right? In terms of the discourse of the able body that's coming to us from, for instance, the late 17th century, the early 18th century, where intelligence becomes such an important thing. So while I was listening to your paper, I was actually thinking about, for instance, Locke's essay on human understanding, and the fact that Locke uses children and idiot as a particular kind of yardstick to establish the fact that we're all born with a clean state, and therefore there is a particular kind of way in which we acquire reason, rationality, our sense of perception. So playing to the certain 19th century notions of sensations, perceptions, the idea of reason as being so vital to a particular sense of the Enlightenment. And for me, that was very, very important precisely because so many disabled studies scholars, especially those working with literary and cultural disability studies, have talked about the Enlightenment as a particular kind of emphasis on the perfect body. The idea of, let's say, the human as perfectible, the human body as perfect, and the sense of the rational mind as superior. So therefore, for instance, Swift scholars have talked about how in the embodiment of the character, Swift himself was someone, Swift's loss of his cognitive capacity, so to say, people have also called it his mental disabilities embodied in a particular way in book 4 especially, right? And for me, what became very interesting, therefore, in your paper, was a sense through which you were looking at this idea of the savage, the monstrous bodily appearance, the emphasis therefore on cognitive faculty. So in this regard, my query to you, therefore, is a sense in which do you want to comment on the idea of the monstrous, the animal, precisely because what you're looking at is, Gulliver's Travels is also read classically, not from the disability studies perspective, but from the literary studies perspective, as the writings of a misanthrope, right? And therefore, if this is something that you just want to give a commonsensical nod to, then what is this idea of, let's say, misanthropism? What is the rejection that is happening there in terms of Gulliver's own engagement? And what, therefore, is this animalization that you're also seeing? Because you're looking at the Yahoos, you're looking at them being presented by in a certain light as being almost subhuman, right? So how would you want to then unpack, as it were, these notions would be my query to you. Shankara, thank you. One of the things that I suppose I enjoyed about your paper was the ways in which you were looking at Gunter Grass as and a particular kind of way in which is allowing for an affirmative shift in terms of just the articulation of what it means to own, let's say, a disabled body. Of course, historically, this book is also read within the purview of the Third Reich, the German World War, the fact that ultimately when you're looking at a character like Oscar and all that he represents, what I'm very interested in, of course, is that the birth of Oscar is marked by the fact that he's cognitively fine, the fact that he's intelligent, that he's a mature adult, but he doesn't want his body to grow beyond that. I mean, his disappointment when the child is born, right? The child that he considers his own, that is born to his stepmother, as it were. His disappointment is, of course, that the child grows, right? Almost as if to say that there's a particular kind of normative trajectory that the child takes, and therefore the child leaves his own, his association with Oscar, as it were. What I'm interested in is in some senses to query you about how you want to read this disappointment. Of course, classically, this novel is also looked at as a response to certain patriarchal gender positions around, let's say, family, especially considering the family being in that sense so integral to the idea of the state, right? And therefore reading this novel in terms of its political history and the kind of comment that Gunter Grass is making. I mean, you're looking at parental neglect here. You're looking at the fact that there is a particular kind of abandonment of Oscar on the basis of his condition. So these are, of course, certain things that are there within disability scholarship, the idea of abandonment, the idea of shame, the idea of the burden of humiliation. And yet you see Oscar as a very different character. You see Oscar as not a do-gooder. He's in that sense someone who's presented alternatively as cruel. You're also seeing a very interesting Oedipal moment there, in the sense that he's responsible for the death of his two fathers, right? So in that sense, I want you to, if possible, comment on whether, choosing as you are to read this from a disability perspective, do you think that there's a possibility of looking at, let's say, the conventions of established ableist, so to say, sensibilities tied very strongly to, for instance, the notion of the family and what a sense of kinship should be, as something that you want to comment on, precisely because you're also looking at care and kinship as far as disabled identities are concerned, as something that is problematic. I'm just giving my three presenters a while to reflect on, I suppose, my queries, and once again reiterating with generosity a great amount of thanks for their papers, while I'm looking into the chat box to see if there are any further queries, comments that have come their way. There was one, I suppose, initially also, so I'm just looking at it. I think there's one for Sunanda already. So what I'll do is either in the same order in which I've asked the questions, if my speakers would like to respond, and then I once again reiterate if the audience could simultaneously either vocalize their questions or put them in the chat box. Thank you.
Okay, shall I answer it then? The one
Yes,
in the
please,
chat box?
please.
Okay. So there
I'll
is.
read out the question.
Okay.
Just give me a moment. So this is Kaustubh's question to Sunanda. A common assumption among critics is that Bertha seems to be used as a trope, a foil to help Jane meet her ends. Here I am reminded of Davis and how he remarks how the novel enforces normalcy. Do you think the narrative lends solely on racist ableism, or is there some redemption in the narrative? Does Jane in any part see Bertha with empathy or merely as a threat and other? Do you think Jane sees Bertha, all things considered? Also, I really liked your delineation of the fire imagery.
Thank you, Kaustubh. Okay, so I'll just give one example. So there are several conversations between Rochester and Jane, and in one particular conversation, of course, I had quoted that at the beginning, wherein he's vindictively cruel towards Bertha. So Jane chides him, and she tells him, and she also reprimands him. And if I could remember it correctly, she says that she can't help being mad. And in response to that, Rochester says that, of course, he is on a back step and then back foot. And then he responds and he says that initially he did think about putting Bertha in Ferndean, but Ferndean, the weather conditions, Ferndean would have killed her. And that is why Bertha was taken to Thornfield. And of course, she is now there in the attic room. But if one looks at this conversation, it doesn't really salvage Bertha. What really happens, is that through all the interactions and recollections and discussions about Bertha, what is happening is that all the artistic resources are being mobilized towards, mainstreaming the abled. So if Jane and Rochester are sympathetically talking about Bertha, it is more so about their character than anything to do about what Bertha is. She is actually the object of their discussion, not the subject for that matter. And it, to me, it seems that there is every conversation about her, whether it's sympathetic, conversation, or a mere recollection of how it was in the past and how she responded to every question that Rochester had asked, and then of course how she responded to the caretakers and all. It seemed as if everything is a sort of a build up to a prescribed, if one may call it, a Victorian iconization of Rochester and Jane. And what happens is that the actions of individuals derive meaning to their life and their being. But here, on a sustained basis, what is happening is that it is the objectification of Bertha which is rendering more meaning to the relationship of Rochester and Jane. And because you specifically mentioned if something changed. So if we even look at the past of Jane Eyre, and one of the most symbolic episodes in her life, of course, is the Red Room episode. Of course, it became a part of the whole feminist discourse and all. And in all of that, we got to know, for the first time, we saw the spirited as well as the sensitive Jane, and a woman who had been through a Red Room and that whole hallucination and fainting episode. After that, for Jane to not take up the fact that there is a woman in the attic room, which is probably even worse than the Red Room. And I don't find any sustained conversation about why that particular room, why not some different space that is assigned to. So this is something that I think, as from a woman's point of view, I did not see a lot coming from Jane. Yes, she was sympathetic, but then that sympathy didn't really, instead of creating something for Bertha, was rather more destructful. And even Rochester's recollection and his being kind, rather than giving a sort of cohesion to Bertha's story, it ends up disintegrating it. So yeah, that's what I feel. Is that okay?
Thank you, Sunanda. I'm just checking in case there are some more questions that have come up for you. Yeah, I think Kaustuv is also thanking you for your response. There's no addendum to it.
Okay.
Would any of our speakers want to respond to some of my queries while we wait to see?
Yeah. Firstly, I would like to add to Sunanda ma'am's response that there is one thing that I noted while I was going through the text, which is Rochester also gets disabled for a temporary period of time, but the irony is that his disability is cured and he is capable of getting married and being loved even with that disability, while Bertha has to die to provide a happy ending to the novel. So therefore this gender discrimination, where a disabled man gets a happy ending, gets to have a happy ending, while a disabled woman can never hope for a happy ending in the society. So that's also a point that I wanted to bring to the notice. So coming to my Gulliver's Travels, since you mentioned, Stryker says that there were thinkers were looking to a natural sequence of events rather than a moral one. So the disability model, it shifted from being charity based to medical based. So everybody was looking at what is the cause of disability. Is there a medical way to treat it? That was being explored, but also very much parallelly there was a assumption by the people that the disabled have to be segregated by the society in order for the society to exist peacefully. I'll bring up an example where there were most of the disabled people in the 18th century who could not afford to have residences for themselves. Those who were well off would marry comfortably and have comfort, but those who were not well off, they had to depend on the better off of the society for their charity. And also subsequently there was with the expansion of population and the restriction of spaces, then there was an idea which was brought to the fore and implemented, which was to have separate institution for disabled people, which would generally be at the outskirts of the city for disabled people to exist. So if you are a disabled person and you are not well off to afford a place for yourself, you will have to live in an institution at the outskirts of the city, and you will not be accepted by the society. So this is the extent to which this disabled non-disabled binary used to exist. And it's also ironic to note here that like other subaltern statuses, for example gender, class, race, all these a person is born into, while disability is not necessarily by birth. A person can acquire disability at any point of their time. So separating disability from the society, because like other marginalization, be it class, be it gender, disability can happen to anybody at any point of time. Still the society chooses to ignore disability for a long period of time, and even if they do recognize persons with disabilities, they treat them as objects, and even decisions about them were taken by other people of the institutions, and decisions for them were taken by institutions which thought that segregating disabled from the society would do benefit for them. So this monstrosity or this animalistic behavior of the disabled people, I don't think it is their issue. It is the issue of the society, which separates them from the what they call as normal. So I think Gulliver, Jonathan Swift's book, maybe intended, unintended, I don't know, but maybe I believe that John Swift also wanted to question the society's hypocrisy and of creating binaries between physical and mental and intellectual attributes of people, how society segregates on the basis of how a person appears and how a person operates in the society, how a person speaks, because it's not just the appearance that Gulliver's facing, it's also intellectual abilities and verbal abilities that he experiences in all the 4 books. So Swift is not just questioning the physical attributes, but also how mental and intellectual attributes are very much responsible for this marginalization of the disabled.
Thank you, Aishwarya. I think this can be considered as there is a comment or question rather for you. I mean, question or observation rather for you. And there is one that I think ties it to Sunanda's paper also. This is again from Kaustubh. He
Okay.
basically is talking about the charge of misanthropy on the narrator of Gulliver's Travels, which basically for him, ironically, takes the text beyond the normative. For instance, he says that it reminds one of Foucault's concept of heterotopia, othered spaces created for the marginalized, especially disabled. So, for instance, he also comments on Bertha's relocation in the attic as a site that can be looked at as a heterotopic site. Would either of our presenters want to comment, concur, disagree?
My understanding of Swift's text and the ending of the novel would be that he was so disgusted or maybe disalienated from the whole human construct, human institutionalization of what has to be normal, what can be accepted, that maybe by the end of the novel, Gulliver chooses to distance himself from this discriminatory nature of the able-bodied society. He's avoiding people not because he wants to be segregated, but he's avoiding people because he wants to avoid himself from this segregated structure of the, so the human institutional.
Okay, can I respond?
Yes, Sunanda, please.
Okay, I'll just respond to Aishwarya first, because she spoke about Rochester's disability, that he's partially cured at the end. There is, of course, the physical disability that is there, but then if you look at the narrative of Rochester, when he's recollecting Bertha's past and he mentions that the family is of mad people, mother is the germs of insanity were there in the entire family, and then his marriage was a deal, a financial deal of 30,000 pounds and things like that. So, and then of course his family was also involved. So one just wonders what is more problematic, whether whether the disabled Rochester at the end was partially cured, or whether this metaphorical blindness that he had at the very beginning of relationship, that he was unable to see what what Bertha was or what his family intended to do with the marriage. So there is this extension of the idea of disability. So that's one point. And about what was the other bit? Just one second. Okay, the heterotopic site. It can be read as a heterotopic site, but what is more concerning for me is that in the whole feminist discourse, Red Room has occupied a space. But correct me if I'm wrong, and with my limited knowledge, somehow Attic Room has never really become a symbol of the telling of the disabled people, for that matter. It may be a heterotopic site. And again, going back to the previous question by Costa, that even if you remove Jane from the story of Jane Eyre, there will still be a story. As intriguing as it is, there might not be a Bildungsroman, but you cannot possibly remove the Attic Room and the so-called mad woman. So it seems as if this heterotopic site is actually the foundation on which the text rests. And somehow I feel that it could have been picked up, and this Attic Room could have been a symbol of empowerment and a symbol of telling for all the people suffering from disability, for that matter. And that is one thing that I have not noticed. Correct me if I am wrong.
Kosta was adding on, making a point with regard to how the Attic Room functions, right, in addendum to what you just said. And his point is that in queer disabled narratives, maybe the attic can be more apt.
Yeah, agree.
Aishwarya, you have, I think, another query from one of our participants, which is Prachi. Adding to Aishwarya's point that people with disabilities belong to higher societies, could marry off easy. Another interesting parallel is that during the 18th century, high society women would actually fake illness and move for treatment to the countryside. But people with actual illnesses or disabilities were seen as not normal, highlighting that a disability or illness is looked differently based on class.
Yeah, actually, that's very true. Because if even if a woman spoke loudly, or even if a woman said that I want to study or I want to take up a job, then it was read as a sign of madness. And so, if, for example, if a woman is, if a woman doesn't faint, and if a woman, she's expressing herself, then hysteria was very popular then. So defining anything that the woman wanted to do which was not normative, that is another kind of normative discourse that can be talked in gendered sense, where hysteria was a kind of disability that was thought of. But I think by 1914, as late as 1914, it was recognized that hysteria in women is not a disability, and hysteria is actually not a it's not a recognized medical term. And hysteria is basically if a man expresses the same sort of features that a hysterical woman does, it's not a medical condition. So hysteria is basically a construct. So yeah, a lot of times there was a fainting and hysterical hysteria was used by mostly in the rich women's depiction in literature. I would not say they were using it, because obviously I have no proof of that, but there was a lot of depiction in literature of women having hysteria, and women being restricted and sent off to far off places for their well-being and for their mental peace.
Kaustuv is adding a point that hysteria can be seen as patriarchy's whitewashing of women's oppression by calling it scientific.
Yeah, very true.
My addition to that point that Prachi had made is actually that, when you're looking at it from class structures, you're also looking at the fact that a particular kind of sense of the urban is getting formed subsequent to the the Industrial Revolution. And you're looking at how 18th century, 19th century, especially since we are dealing with, in the sense of the two texts, you're looking at England shaping itself out in terms of how these urban spaces are and how they work. The idea of the freak, the idea of the circus, the idea of these Victorian sideshows that present people, the very fact that the norm as a word comes into the lexicon in the 19th century, right? There is something very telling about this moment, precisely because I'm also looking at the fact that if one of the early comments that has existed in terms of literature and repairing the disabled body, I'm looking at, for instance, Flaubert's famous The Saint Madame Bovary, where you're looking at the surgery of Hippolyte, right? And the fact that Hippolyte is perfectly happy with himself as it is, but it is the bourgeois middle class. This, as much as Flaubert's novel is a commentary on the middle class sense of a particular kind of standardization, a particular kind of sense of sensibility. And therefore, you're looking at the varied ways in which Flaubert's novel is looked at as a critique of bourgeois sensibility. So when, let's say, there's a recovery of it from, let's say, disability studies, especially within literary and cultural disability study, there's a mark in which you're looking at the need to standardize the body, the sense of recuperating the disabled body, to make the disabled body back into, or make it in that sense acceptable within the sense of the normal, right? Which is very important, a very important thing that is happening in the 19th century. And therefore, to add on to Prachi's point, right, that part of it is, of course, a particular kind of way in which public discourse is shaping itself out through the 18th century and culminating to a particular kind of stand view or viewpoint in the 19th century. And to agree with both Aishwarya and Prachi to tell you that therefore the kind of ways in which, let's say, kinship bonds and friendship and intimacies are fostered by people who are outside the bounds of middle class normativity is very different. So the idea, I would actually say that, which is why I brought in the idea of the freaks, the sense of the outlier, as it were, because you're seeing connects, which is why which is what resonated for me in Shankara's paper, the idea of the dysfunctional family is, and the fact that this is a character who's, of course, cruel, playing to in that sense the notions of the kind of ways in which you're looking at, let's say, disabled characters as evil, wicked, etc., and yet doing something very different. I mean, in the sense that Günter Grass achieves something very different, owing to, of course, the kind of political comment that the novel unravels for us, which is why there's such an important need to look at, for instance, the kind of critique that is coming of the liberal state, disabled subjectivity from disability studies scholars. But again, that was just two pieces in. I'm just going back to the chat because I think there is some other comment that has just popped up. No, I was mistaken. So it's just Kaustubh is the last point. Shankara, would you want to respond in terms of the kind of conversation that our participants have been having?
Yeah, it was good, and I'll come to my the queries that you raised to me. The condition that Oscar feels when his son, I mean, his stepmother's or his wife's son or his stepmother's son starts growing, he feels really disheartened, and then all the while was expecting that his son has to be like him, or he should also be not growing, and that we see there. And coming to the next question that you raised, it's about the care and the kinship that the family could have, extended to Oscar, so that Oscar would not have, would not have been so as he was in the novel. When we understand this, so to say, the family, I mean, the only care and concern that he could receive is from his mother, Agnes. And if we understand who is his father, then it is not clear in the novel whether it is, Oscar, whether it's Mazarat or whether it's, say, Bronsky. And there was a triangular relationship between three of them: Agnes, Bronsky, and Mazarat. There is no kind of a family orientation there, or Oscar could not get the morals there, and then and I would say in every part of the novel we see Oscar is exposed to, say, we see there is no real family orientation with regard to Oscar's period of growing up. And whatever he comes on his way, or a kind of they intrigue him that he should not be like this, or he should be something else. So in that way, he did not get the real care and kinship. If he had got, he would not have been a character who is so resistant, and then you would not have been a dwarf at all. You would have decided to grow up. There I end. I think I have answered. I don't know to what extent I made sense.
No, thank you for your response. Would there be any further comments from the attendees of this session? All right, there seems to be nothing that anybody seems to be writing in the chat box. Once again, I thank our three paper presenters for their papers and for the kind of conversations that your papers facilitated and enabled. Thank you. And I thank all of our participants for the generosity of their time in being such keen auditors. Thank you also to our interpreters who've been facilitating the process of making this conference a little more inclusive. Thank you, and thank you to the organizers. Anurima, I think we are done with this session. I'm handing over to you.
Yeah. Prachi has put in a question. Is it possible to have the email IDs of all presenters for any further discussions? I think that would be possible. Please write to us, and we'll share the email IDs with you. So I think with that, we come to an end of today's session. And tomorrow is the grand finale. We have the technical sessions in the beginning, that is from 2:30 to 4:30. We'll have the sessions on narrativizing disability to disability and education, and disability and cinema. This will be followed by the valedictory session, which is from 5 p.m. to 6:30 p.m. We'll have Anita Ghai as a speaker, and followed by the concluding remarks and the vote of thanks. So with that, I we've come to the end of the session. Thank you so much, Karuna, for doing such a great job of chairing this panel. And, thanks to the presenters and to the interpreters and to all the participants who stayed with us and interacted. Thank you so much. See you all
Thank you.
tomorrow.